Soon may the wellerman come, bring us coffee, tea, and rum. One day when the tonguing is done, take our leave and go. At a fair on the town, her hair was blonde and her dress was brown. Soon may the wellerman come around.
It's been 7 months since I built the 12-foot sail and oar skiff prominently featured on this channel back in November of 2023. Now in late June of 2024, that boat building urge has struck again. I happened across some plans for an English punt of the style used on canals, especially near Oxford, and I really admired its simplicity and utility. And I thought, man, this really would not be difficult to hammer together even in a weekend. This got me thinking about different variations of a punt type design with 4 sides and a very flat bottom, and upswept bow and stern. And I started making some simple models of cardstock, and modeling is dangerous because modeling can lead to building an actual boat. The first model was 12 foot overall and still recognizable as a punt, but as my thinking progressed and evolved, I ended up with an 8-foot punt. To the eye, this design certainly looks like the pram that everyone's familiar with, but it has a few characteristics that to me are very punt-like. A 4-foot span of the midsection of the boat is essentially dead flat on the bottom. The stern rises to keep it from dragging, and the bow gently curves up. The sides are almost dead vertical. I believe I put in about a 5-degree flare to the top sides. She'll end up being 8 foot 1 inch overall and 45 inches of beam. This was meant to be a fun, lighthearted build for minimal expense and not taking up a lot of time either. You can't expect great performance characteristics from any dinghy this short and fat, but if it comes out right, I do expect to have a fun little pram that's extremely portable, stable for fishing, and hopefully has some good sailing ability. For this budget build, I'll be planking bow, stern, and topsides with some pretty poor quality knotty white pine. But man, this stuff was cheap, and I believe it'll hold up well enough, but it'll be interesting to see how long it does last. I always spend a good amount of time going through the stack at the lumberyard trying to pick the best boards I can find, and the vast majority were just complete trash, but I found 4 1x12x8s that I found to be acceptable. As bizarre as it may sound, the bottom will be planked with plain old 3/8 exterior plywood sheathing, and that's just another experiment to see what kind of cheap materials I can get away with. I begin by laying out the planks on my handy boat builder's picnic table and carefully scribe the shape of the topsides, trying to figure out a way to dodge the worst knots, and I think I was mostly successful on that. My original design had the bow and stern rising at a perfectly straight angle. I realized in the real world, plywood may not want to bend that sharply over a mere 8 foot. Rather than trying to force the plywood to conform to a harsh angle, I decided to use this flexible ruler to scribe a curve, just to smooth out the transition. The stern doesn't rise nearly as sharply, so I just left that angle flat. With the sides marked out and measured twice, I begin cutting the rake of the transoms and the sweep of the bottom. Rather than marking both planks out by measuring, I prefer to lay the first one cut on top of the second plank and simply trace it. I feel that you achieve better symmetry this way. It also saves a little time. With the planks clamped together, I use a belt sander to make the edges perfectly symmetrical and also to smooth out the transition from the flat bottom to the sweep of the bow and stern. With the top sides complete, you can now see the general shape of the hull, and you'll notice that the bottom is completely flat at the midsection in the interest of maximizing stability. The bow and stern are cut out of the same white pine material as the top sides. I like to allow them to stand a little bit proud, just to gain some extra height at the front and back of the boat, and I always cut a crown, which is just a fair curve on the top of each transom. That simple curve just goes a long way to making the boat look a lot nicer, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. With the major hull components finished, it's time to begin assembly. I start by marking the midpoint on each of the side planks and fasten them to a slightly trapezoidal mold that is in turn fastened to the strong back used to build the previous two skiffs that I made, the 12 and the 16. Just like building a flat iron skiff or a Sharpie, there is only one single mold dead in the middle of the hull, and this won't result in a perfectly symmetrical boat, but it should be good enough. And there's also some ways that you can tweak and sort of square up the hull, as it will tend to rack in one direction or the other. Fitting and fastening the bow and stern accurately is the most critical part of the build. Pre-drilling and countersinking for screws is an absolute must. Before permanently screwing and gluing, I use a couple of finish screws as locators to first get the alignment just right. When the planks are aligned, I partially back out the locator screws, apply my construction adhesive, and join it all together. It should be noted that the edge of the bow and stern must be beveled to accommodate the angle at which they intersect the side plank. The screws driven through the side plank into the bow are not at a 90-degree angle, and sometimes it can be tricky to drive those just right in a straight line to the bow or transom. Even after the several boats that I've built, I still make dumb mistakes like this. It's definitely not the end of the world, but it does look really bad. Nothing that a little filler can't fix. Looking at the wooden boats I've built, people always want to know, how did you get those boards to bend like that? There really is not much to it. Just a pair of ratchet straps is all you need, and a little patience, and you just have to go slow. Bending the planks is not difficult, but this is the step where something is most likely to go wrong. There's always a potential for discovering a weak spot in the wood that just gives way, and so for that reason I just take it very slow and give the wood some time to realize that it's going to be taking on a slightly different form. Chances are the planks will not bend perfectly evenly, and that's alright with me. It's all part of the folk art of building a flat bottom wooden boat. As I run out of travel on one strap, I simply start taking up tension on the other and just continue alternating until the bend is complete and it's time to fasten the transom at the stern. Joining the hull with the transom is just the same as joining the bow, but it's a little trickier because now the whole thing is under tension and you kind of have to work it to get everything lined up just right, and usually have to apply a little bit of muscle. You can use the straps to help that final alignment to a degree, but you don't want to over tighten because there's not really a controlled way to release that, or at least it's a lot more difficult than tightening. With the hardest and most critical work out of the way, I now have a structure that looks very much like a boat. You could say these are the bones of the pram. It's a good time to get some support under the bow and stern to prevent the whole thing from teeter-tottering back and forth as you work on it. Before the bottom can be laid, I need a good flat mating surface, so I have to do some cleaning up on the edges of the planking. On a boat with more flare in the top sides, I would typically start out with a power planer and then do the last little bit with my belt sander, but here the flare is so minimal that the sander with some 80 grit is going to do the job in a short amount of time. The bow, however, has a lot of rake, and so there I will be using the planer. It probably looks like I'm just making a mess, but you'll have to trust me that a little electric blower like this is great for keeping a woodshop clean as you work. Relative to its short length, this pram has a pretty healthy amount of rocker in the bottom. This curve will make the hull a little more efficient, prevents the stern from dragging, hopefully prevents the bow from plowing, and the bend itself will actually dramatically strengthen the plywood. With the 3/8 plywood sheathing temporarily screwed down, I trace the outline of the hull from underneath. For the best fit and appearance, I've found it's best to saw just the outside of your pencil line, leaving a little bit hanging out, and then come back with a belt sander and sand it down to be perfectly flush with the side planking. Failing to heed my own advice, I ended up thinking that I could cut perfectly to the pencil line, and then when I got the bottom on the boat, a couple places were sitting just a little bit to the inside of the side planking. But as long as you're not off too bad, it's really just a matter of appearance. After dry fitting the plywood to check accuracy, I lay down a bead of glue and lay the plywood over the hull. This is best done with a helper to avoid smearing the glue like I did. With the clock somewhat ticking on the glue setting up, I begin fastening the bottom. Using 1 5/8 inch number 8 screws, I drive the screws directly into the side planking. There are no chine logs on this boat, which is just sort of an extra piece of lumber on the bottom that increases the surface area that the plywood bottom is being secured to. The use of chine logs is a better way of building that results in a stronger, longer lasting boat, but this is just a fun, lighthearted build, and for a dinghy this small, I don't find that to be strictly necessary at all. Historically, many small skiffs were built without chine logs. And now for the big moment, flip it over and see what kind of a boat we've got. With the pram upright, the first order of business is removing the mold and installing a central thwart. The mold is actually holding the side planks apart, supporting them, so before I can remove it, I have to first install the central thwart. I decide to place the main central rowing thwart just forward of the midpoint of the hull, and this is to allow for heavier gear to be carried in the stern and also to provide plenty of space to sit in the bottom when sailing. A pair of simple cleats, which are really just wood blocks, will help to support the seat and to fasten it in, and the seat itself will be fashioned from a pine 1x12, and I will simply scribe the curve of the hull underneath the seat and cut it out. There will be a little bit of trial and error in getting it fit just right. Ideally, the edge of the seat would also be beveled to match the flare of the top sides, but for this build, I'm not really going to bother. It's not necessary. That's more of a matter of appearance. A simple strut under the rowing thwart provides support for the seat and also further stiffens the hull. The bow seat is really not a seat, but is necessary to tie together and strengthen the bow, and will also help to support the sailing rig. I happen to have a pair of sockets and oar locks for an old project that never really came to fruition, so I fashioned a couple of risers, and I am going to need pretty tall risers here, but in hindsight, I should have had the grain running long ways. I don't know what I was thinking on that, but I realized my mistake and I just made a reinforcing block with the grain running in the opposite direction and tacked it onto the riser. The stern sheets are structurally critical as a means of reinforcing and tying together the transom and topsides, and may actually prove to be a functional seat, though the possibility of actually carrying a passenger is somewhat dubious. The skeg can always be replaced or modified, but I'm leaving it on the large side to begin with. I'm hoping that this will greatly improve the boat's straight line tracking for one thing, with it being so short, and also improve its lateral resistance for sailing a beam reach or maybe even a little bit closer. In the interest of simplicity, I just don't really feel the need for a dagger bore trunk with this build, although I could retrofit one if I wanted to, and I may even experiment with a simple lee board. Sydney helped me choose the color, and I really do like it. It's a little more lighthearted and fun than the stately colors I would normally use on my boats. As I roll out the first coat of paint, Sydney is musing over what this pram should be called, and I'm really not very good at naming boats. I named my O'Day Osprey Bridget, but Sydney doesn't call it that. She refers to it as Myrtle May, so it really doesn't matter what I name the boat. I allowed the paint some time to dry, and the morning of launch day and final assembly is upon us. After reassembling the seats and bending in the rails, it's off to the water for the first test float. So far, so good. We're still floating, but it seems pretty tight, and I'd say it's a successful test so far. I found out some information that I needed to know, especially before carrying on with building a sailing rig. So I wanted to make sure there would be a comfortable way to sit and that the boat would still be stable, sitting with my legs stretched out like this, midship, just legs stretched out across the beam. And this is very comfortable. I've got plenty of room, and the boat's only heeling over very slightly. Definitely not going to be breaking any speed records with this little dinghy, but I kind of knew that already. When you get a very short and fat hull with a flat bottom, that does not make good rowing characteristics. But this isn't really meant to cover any great distances. This is just something to just float in a little cove like this. It would make a very stable fishing platform, and I'm hoping it'll make for a little bit of fun sailing. Overall, I was happy with how the pram had turned out, and really, it turned out to be a better boat than I expected. The hull seemed tight, it was very stable, and easy enough to row. Obviously, not great, it's an 8-foot pram, but most importantly, you can do this. The pram does just fine with oars, so the next step is to get her fitted out to sail. And in the spirit of this affordable, relatively low effort build, I'm going to start by just trying out the rig that I have, the lug sail that I use with the 12-foot skiff, and just drop it into the mast step and see what it does. And to be honest, that 31 square foot lug sail is much better sized to this pram in theory than it is to the 12, even though it drives the 12 just fine. Of course, I'll have to fabricate a rudder, and a couple of other modifications will have to be made before we can set out under sail. All that and more on the next episode. Hope to see you there. Pennants are now available at cumberlandrover.com. Historically flown for signal purposes, a pennant is that indescribable something that your boat is missing. They can help you read the wind, increase visibility of your small craft, and they just look cool, fluttering from the masthead or yard of a lug sail. You can have any color you want, as long as it's bright red. I have 2 styles of pennant now available at cumberlandrover.com.